Welcome back to Yu-Gi-Oh! History with Giorlando. In today's video, we are going to take a deep dive look at Brandon Wigley's Giargia deck from the top 64 of the 2014 North American World Championship qualifiers. Now, Giargia's is not a deck that was brand new in 2014. It had actually been around for a couple of years, first debuting in the fall of 2012 at YCS Toronto. Giargia is a deck primarily based around the idea of recurring card advantage and continually generating card advantage through cards like Giargia Dex and Giargia Armor. However, when Giargia's first debuted in the fall of 2012, they did not have access to arguably their most powerful card, Giargia Gear. The deck list that we're going to take a look at today emphasizes that card by utilizing 3 copies of Giargia Gear and 4 level 3 Giargiano targets. Giargia's as a archetype were competitive at the end of 2012 into the early 2013 season. Like most decks, though, as 2013 went rolling on, the release of the Dragon Rulers and Spellbook of Judgment forced Giargia's to be pushed off to the side with just about every archetype at the time, from Mermills to Fire Fists to everything in between, because during the summer of 2013, there was really only 2 major decks, Spellbooks and Dragon Rulers. However, after limitations to the Dragon Rulers and the banning of Spellbook of Judgment, old archetypes like Giargia's at the end of 2013 began to re-emerge, which is where we're just about going to pick up. The summer of 2014 is known as one of the most diverse Nationals formats of all time. Now, the finals in the 2014 North American World Championship qualifiers featured 2 hat players. The format as a whole incorporated a variety of trap-heavy decks like Hat and Fat and Cat, Invusions, and of course the deck we're going to talk about today, Giargia's. But it also featured other more aggressive, high-powered decks with very few traps like Sylvans and Lightsworns. Some more of the controlling trap but also aggressive decks like Dragon Rulers, utilizing only 1 copy of each of the limited Dragon Rulers. Brandon Wigley was able to pilot a Giargia deck that combined the power of the Giargia engine with 1 single main deck copy of Tractor Termelio to really put into focus how much of an emphasis there was on a very robust trap lineup. A robust trap lineup that had both defensive cards like Fiendish Chain, but then also combo cards like Giargia Gear. But without further ado, let's take a deep dive look at Brandon Wigley's top 64 deck list from the 2014 North American World Championship qualifiers. All right, we'll start with the monsters. We have, of course, 3 copies of Armor. You want to access Armor as soon as possible. Ideally, on the first turn, you set Armor and a bunch of trap cards. Assuming Armor gets to survive, which can sometimes be encouraged with the amount of trap cards that you run, you end up generating a ton of card advantage, and then you just flip it back face down. There are some matchups, like the Atlantean or Mermail matchup, where you have to worry about it getting hit by Marksman. It's kind of an interesting matchup because usually the Mermail player will run more Marksman than Infantries. Those are the 2 Mermail/Atlantean cards that could actually destroy Armor. There are some cases where you actually want to pass with a face-up Armor, depending on the quantity of Infantry or Marksmen that they have remaining. What I mean by that is, instead of using the effect to flip it face down, in some cases it's actually better to, special summon it off Arsenal and leave it in defense mode. That way, if it survives, which, depending on the quantity of Infantry and Marksmen are left in their deck, will make this play more apparent. On your turn, you can flip it face down, then flip it face up, and then try and protect it while it's face up instead of face down. Typically you think about it, you set it, you always set it, it's best set. Yes, there are actually some circumstances, though, where you like to pass to your opponent with it face up. It sort of depends on what your opponent's running. And it's not even inconceivable that your opponent could be running Nobleman of Crossout of all things, in which case putting this face up to play around Nobleman in games 2 and 3 is actually something to consider. Then, of course, we have 3 copies of Arsenal. Arsenal is really important because it accesses your Armor immediately, but it also combines with MK2 to create a pseudo tour guide effect. I'll talk about that in a little bit. It's also a relatively strong monster, 1700 just naturally. It boosts itself by 200 for every gear on your field. 200 for itself, and then 200 for something else. All of a sudden, it's a 1900 Lone Fire Blossom, essentially. Then you have 3 accelerators. Accelerators are important because obviously you can special summon them, which allows you to make rank 4 plays typically. But they also recur gears out of the graveyard. It can make it so that the grind game, this deck has a lot of flexibility. If you've run out of cards in your deck to search off Armor, you can just start to search them out of the graveyard. So obviously a lot of flexibility there. Be careful, this card can miss timing though. Next up, we have the small gears, the level 3s. We have 1 Giargiano. This allows you to tribute to summon a gear from the graveyard, and then 3 MK2s. When the Giargia Gear trap card was released, the quantity of level 3s jumped from 3 to 4. In earlier builds of this deck, before the trap card was released, you saw a lot of players run maybe 2, sometimes 3 copies of MK2. Some of the earlier versions of this deck did that. Giorlando itself, without the MK, was added in order to make it so that you can access the trap card at least twice, maybe 3 times if we start to talk about Daigusto or Merle effects. What this card allows you to do, though, is basically turn itself into a tour guide if you have access to an arsenal in the graveyard. MK2 special summons a gear from the graveyard, and then if you have arsenal in the graveyard, you can just tribute off the arsenal to search your deck, usually for Giorgiano if it's available. And then now you have 2 level 3s, and now all of a sudden it's basically a tour guide where 1 monster with its normal summon effect resulted in 2 level 3s on the board. I remember when this deck first came out at YCS Toronto. I think it was 2012 YCS Toronto. And Billy ran this deck, Billy Break, and he told me that the deck has 3 copies of Tour Guide, and that was the main reason why he wanted to run it. And he was referring to that interaction that I just described there. That once you get access to Arsenal, it turns your MK2s into pseudo Tour Guides. And this was the event immediately after the limitation of Tour Guide from 3 to 2, which was one of the main reasons why he made that comment. In terms of non-gears, this deck runs 2 copies of Maxi as the primary hand trap, which usually at least can 1-for-1 a lot of decks. It's one of the main reasons why Maxi is such a powerful card. Almost every deck, it will at least cycle 1-for-1, and then obviously there are matchups where it's way better than that. And then 1 copy of Traptrix Mermelio, this deck being a really trap-heavy deck, is a deck that could really utilize a card like this. This is Brandon Wigley's exact deck from the top 64 of the 2014 Nationals. And one of the things that he said in his deck profile was the fact that he was looking for another monster that helped filter out some of those hands where you drew a lot of monsters without traps, because Mermelio at least obviously poses as a monster, but obviously then searches a trap, like Bottomless, for example. So this was his trap lineup, or rather his monster lineup. Going into the spells, we're at a point in Yu-Gi-Oh's history where Upstart Goblin is obviously incredibly popular. The Sylvan deck that I profiled from this format ran the 3 copies of Upstart Goblin. A lot of decks ran full 3 copies of Upstart. This is one of those. So you even saw that in trap-heavy decks, just making a deck 37 cards. In terms of spells that have a little bit more of an impact, we have 2 copies of Soul Charge. You could theoretically run 3 copies. You know, you go back and you play this format, and every time you activate and resolve Soul Charge, you think to yourself, oh my gosh, this is the most powerful thing I could be doing. And then there are just some games where it's late and you have 2 copies in hand and you have 1,200 life and you're like, great, it's a really bad Monster Reborn. So I can totally understand looking at this deck and saying, Soul Charge is a benefit that's not explicitly necessary for me to have success. It's a luxury when I get to use it, and I'm great when I draw it early. I don't want to rely on it. This isn't Sylvan's. This isn't one of those decks like the Mythic Ruler Dragon deck that really relied on Soul Charge. This deck happily activates Soul Charge early in the game, but it's not a backbone. This deck can easily win without it. Then we have just some, I won't say staples, but cards that were really popular one-ups: Book of Moon, Mind Control, and Dark Hole. And then we have a really robust trap lineup. When you talk about this format in summer of 2014, there were quite a few decks that really emphasized the trap lineup. You obviously had Hat, Gears, Bujins, and a few others. So let's take a look at a really robust trap lineup at the time. First, we have 3 copies of Fiendish Chain. Just a really versatile trap card, hits everything at least a little bit. Then we have a bunch of 2-ofs. We have 2 copies of Black Horn of Heaven. There were a lot of cards in this format that Black Horn of Heaven obviously hit. We're talking about a format where basically every deck is going to Exceed monsters. And if you're not hitting Exceed monsters, there's also cards like Judgment Dragon that you could hit out of the Lightsworn matchup. So Black Horn of Heaven absolutely had a space in that format. It's one of those cards that can really catch you up. You know, for example, if your opponent goes first and sets armor, you unfortunately didn't draw Solemn Warning, so they get the armor search, but maybe your opponent wants to go aggressive and they search Accelerator to go into Geargia and X. At least you can Black Horn of Heaven there. It might be able to catch you up. From that point on, we also then have 2 copies of Traptrix Trap Hole Nightmare. It's one of the targets for the Mermelio. It's a card in this format that was really powerful, really popular as well. Not only just, obviously, in the Hat deck, the deck that primarily utilized the Traptrix engine, even in a deck that only had 1 Mermelio. We had people having success with this card. So 2 copies of Traptrix Trap Hole Nightmare. We had 2 copies of Wiretap. This is a format, obviously, without Heavy Storm. You may have noticed that. Wiretap was really popular in the trap decks, and it was a big discussion point. Do you play 2 of these or 3 of these? Well, in this format, you have to worry about Lightsworns and Sylvans as the 2 primary decks. They're going to have virtually no trap cards. In the case of Lightsworn, just the Needlebug Nest, the card that mills 5. Just in the case of Sylvans, usually Vanity's Emptiness and the version that I profiled and ran at Nationals, Rivalry of Warlords. But in either case, you're not overwhelmingly worried about either of those. It's nice to hit a Needlebug Nest with Wiretap, but you'd rather just not even risk it and not have a Wiretap in your deck at all. So this was a concession to those very few trap decks, the decks that really utilize primarily monsters and spells. Only 2 copies of Wiretap, but in the mirror match, obviously it's incredible because it hits a bunch of the counter traps, obviously, but it hits Gear. And then in decks like Trap Tricks, whether it's with hands and artifacts, whether it was with Fire Fists or Curry Bandits, obviously there's a bunch of trap cards that you can pinpoint. Of course, another 3 of trap actually is Gear. This card really changed the way this deck was run. As I mentioned before, this deck existed prior to the release of this card, and it was, relatively successful. This card, though, allowed you to search 2 copies of the level 3 Giorlando. It's why now we had to bump up the count from potentially 2, definitely all the way up to 4, running the full copies of MK2 and then the single copy of Giorlando. This card's really awesome. There's some really cool tricks that you can do with this card. This card, like Return from the Different Dimension or any trap card that special summons monsters, makes it so that you can orchestrate your chains in such a way that you can resolve this card and utilize the fact that you can chain it. What I mean by that is you could summon a monster, or your opponent could summon a monster, and in the response window to the summon, you could go Chainlink 1 Gear, Chainlink 2 Torrential Tribute. That way, Torrential will resolve, clear the board, and then Gear will resolve on a clear field. There are also some really cool plays with Exciton Knight, where you can use Exciton Knight in Gear in that same fashion, where it's your turn, it's in main phase 1, you go activate Gear, Chainlink 1, Chainlink 2, Exciton Knight wipes the board, Gear resolves as Chainlink 1, special summons 2 gears from the deck, and now all of a sudden it's a clear field. You still have Exciton Knight, now you're going into Geargia X, if not, maybe Abyss Dweller, depending on the matchup. So this is one of the best cards because the fact that it's a trap allowed you to make a lot of really great plays and utilize the fact that you could activate it in response to different things. And then we have some really power 1-ups. We have Torrential and Solemn Warning. Solemn Warning is such a pivotal card this format. We have the single bottomless. It was limited to 1 at this point. So when we combine it with the other Trap Trick, Trap Hole Nightmares, we have 3 targets for Myrmelio, and then 1 copy of Breakthrough Skill. This was a concession for things like Felgrand out of the Sylvan matchup. If you went second in that matchup and you didn't open Max C, if you take a scan over of this trap lineup, there's not a lot of really great counters to Felgrand. Black Horn of Heaven's too late. Fiendish Chain, it's okay. This card theoretically can eventually get you an out, but there's really not a lot of great outs. Well, Breakthrough Skill is one of those cards where you can set your Geargia armor, set some trap cards, and reliably Breakthrough Skill the Felgrand, and then on your turn, Breakthrough Skill it again. And then hopefully that's enough for you to take advantage back from the Sylvan player. But that is our main deck. Moving on, we will first talk about the extra deck. So this deck is going to utilize basically all rank 4 and then rank 3s. So the deck you would typically think is a rank 4 deck, but we talked about MK2 and how it can basically turn into a tour guide when combined with Arsenal. So we needed a robust rank 3 lineup as well to utilize that. But we'll start, of course, with the 3 copies of Geargia X. This card, absolutely the backbone of the deck. It allows you to search your graveyard or your deck for machine cards, which enables you not only just to summon gears, but also to search cards in your side deck. We'll talk about that in a little bit. In addition to that, when this card leaves the field, you can special summon back a level 3 gear from your graveyard. The best one to summon back usually is Geargiano, because when you special summon back Geargiano, you can use Geargiano's effect to special summon a gear from your graveyard. Now, technically, the effect of that monster is negated, so you can't just go and grab an armor and think to yourself, wow, I'm in great shape, I can flip it face down. But you can search an accelerator, which at least allows you to return a gear from the graveyard to your hand. So if this guy gets destroyed on your turn, you basically can make it so that you float into a monster that recurs itself, or at least recurs the advantage that you lost. So Geargia X, obviously a fantastic card, full 3 copies. Other rank 4s, obviously we're going to play Diamond Direwolf out to anything that we need. Rhapsody, this card is actually really useful. Fairly recently, I played a couple of matches against Pac on his stream. Shout out to Pac. Awesome guy, awesome stream. I highly recommend that you watch. I played this exact gear deck. He played a Mermail Atlantean deck, and I went into Rhapsody a couple times in the matchup to banish his title, but also just banish potential targets for Soul Charge. It's one of those cards that having the double DD Crow effect can be really useful for a lot of reasons. So Rhapsody's awesome. It also can boost your monsters. The 1200 attack is no joke in this deck. We have a Karagorgon. This one is useful because the 2450 is a pretty reasonable amount of attack strength. There was one match where I needed to attack over his 24 defense Abystius, and this was the way to do it, so that's really useful. And then we have, of course, Abyss Dweller, basically a staple at this point. Fantastic, obviously, against Mermails, but useful against a variety of other matchups as well. Bujins, for example. Exotonite, I talked about this card. This is sort of the original Zeus or Black Rose effect. When modern Yu-Gi-Oh! People think about how powerful Zeus is. Well, Exotonite had a lot of limitations. You could only use it if your opponent possessed more cards than you. You could only use it during your main phase and your opponent's battle phase. But it nevertheless was still incredibly powerful. The fact that you could activate it as a quick effect enabled you to make chains. I talked about a little bit earlier, going Giargia, Gear, Chainlink 1, Exotonite, Chainlink 2. That happened a lot with this deck, so having that ability and flexibility was incredible. We have an Honor Arc, obviously a fantastic rank 4. We had Emerald, which was really useful for shuffling back the level 3 gears so that you could activate Giargia Gear multiple times. It also came up when you needed to shuffle back things like Dweller. And then this one's a little bit debatable. So in this format, I would run Giant Hand if I owned one. Obviously, it's a prize card, and this goes into the discussion that we've had a few times before. Should you include prize cards if you go back and play these retro formats? I think Giant Hand is a fair prize card. I don't think it's overpowered like Crush Card Virus. I could understand if you decided that, you know what, I had no access to this card, I'm not going to play it. No, thank you. Brandon Wigley, that's the individual who I'm profiling today, did in fact have a copy in his Nationals Top 64 deck list. So I think if you wanted to replicate his deck perfectly, obviously you would include it. But as you notice, this is the last rank 4, so there are plenty of other good ones. Heartland Draco, if you're worried about dealing damage. Cowboy, if you're worried about dealing damage. So there are plenty other reasonable replacements, not make you pressured into feeling you need to include Giant Hand. And then for our rank 3s, we had Tempo, Alucard, Zenmaines, and then Soul of Silver Mountain. I love Soul of Silver Mountain. It's one of my favorite cards. With Soul of Silver Mountain, what it allows you to do is target one of your opponent's set back rows and make it so they can no longer activate it as long as Soul of Silver Mountain's on the field. So it kind of acts a little bit like Alucard, though Alucard obviously can hit monsters, so it's a little bit different in that sense. But then when Soul of Silver Mountain destroys a monster while it still has an attachment, which means you can't just attach twice and get this effect, but when you attack while it has an attachment and destroy one of your opponent's monsters, it then allows you to recur an Earth monster from your graveyard. This deck obviously has all Earth monsters, so that's an incredibly useful effect and enables you to make plays where you recur things from the graveyard like accelerators and whatnot. And that allows you to essentially take 2 level 3 monsters and eventually result in a level 4 monster. So obviously really useful there. So that is our extra deck. Next, we'll talk about the top matchups at the time. So in the most recent 2014 video, so I'm talking about a video that I posted about Sylvans not too long ago, somebody commented and said, you know, give any love to Madolche's. Madolche's technically top nationals. And you're not wrong. I actually lost to a Madolche deck at the ARG 20K that year. So you know what? I will comment that Madolche's, although a rogue-ish deck, a deck that was actually pretty good but not overwhelmingly popular, it existed. I'll give it credit. Obviously, you have to worry about the mirror match. You have to worry about dragon decks, usually decks that have the Mythic Water and Mythic Earth package. The remnants of the Spellbook deck. So we're not talking Spellbook of Judgment. We're talking maybe World of Prophecy, more of a controlling deck. Not that the original deck with Spellbook of Judgment wasn't a control deck, but not quite the same format. Sylvans, which was the deck of choice for myself during this format. I didn't comment on this one before, but, you know, technically maybe Evil Swarms. It wasn't overwhelmingly popular. It didn't counter the format as well as it used to. This deck was particularly good when everyone was running the Dragon Ruler or Spellbook decks, and then you had Eradicator potentially in your main deck, so you had ways of counteracting both of the top decks, but I'll comment on it. I remember I did play a matchup during one of the ARGs with Sylvans against Evil Swarm, so I will add that. Then, another Evil Swarm. Then, of course, we have Trap Trick decks. So whether you have the Trap Tricks with the hands, with Curry Bandit, with Fire Fist, or with artifacts, usually a combination of the Trap Tricks and the artifacts, and then one of these 3 in the middle. Those fairly trap-heavy decks, of course, made up a large portion of the format. Then you had Mermills, you had Light Sworns, pretty popular deck at the time. Triple Judgment Dragon were common in those decks. You had Infernities, and then to represent Bujins, because I don't actually own any Bujin cards, I'll just put a Kaiser Coliseum, because that was such a focal point of that trap-heavy deck. So very diverse format. In terms of the side deck, we had the last copy of Maxi, which obviously was really good against any of the decks like Madolche's, maybe to a certain extent decks like Dragon Ruler, definitely Sylvans and Mermills that are going to special summon a lot. I just took out of my actual current Yu-Gi-Oh! Deck in the side deck Cycle Reader. Cycle Reader had an interesting place in this format for a few reasons in this deck. One, it is a machine, so you actually can search it off Giargia and X and recur it from the graveyard, which means you only need 1 copy in your 40-card main deck. It allowed you to search it when you needed it, send it to the graveyard when you needed the effect, and then recur it back to your hand. This was really good because against Lightsworns, it was almost an auto win. It allowed you to pinpoint the exact light monsters, make it so they basically can never get to Judgment Dragon, disrupt their Light Ray Diabolos, disrupt all of their light-based effects, and make it so that they had to deal with this every single turn. Imagine your Lightsworn player who just can never get to 4 Lightsworns because you just pick 2 of them off every single turn, double DD Crow. And then against Bujins, you can pick off all of those graveyard effects. So all of the various Bujins that they send during the end phase with Yamada, you can just pluck them every single turn. DD Crow ×2 every single turn, make it so that, yeah, they can still beat you. Buoyage Incarnation and whatnot are good cards, but they have a very difficult time trying to control the game the way that deck wants. So definitely 1 copy of Psycho Reader, and again, you only need 1 copy. We have a second copy of Myrmelio because this deck actually has a bunch of trap holes in the side deck that I'll talk about in just a moment. So it made it so that we had 2 copies going into games 2 and 3 if needed. 3 copies of MST. This deck didn't have any traditional spell and trap card removal in the main deck, so we have the 3 copies of MST here on the side. Some Floodgates. This format, there are plenty of decks where Macro and D-Fissure, which were both limited to 1, would put in a lot of work. Against Mermails, if you open with either of these cards, it's basically game over. I recently played Pack on stream. I commented on that earlier, and in one of the games, I opened D-Fissure, and it basically ended just right there. But these cards are obviously unbelievable. Turn 1 against Sylvans. They can be pretty good, obviously, against decks like Dragon Ruler, Lightsworns, Infernities. Obviously, these 2 cards put in a lot of work. Even Bujins, quite frankly, really rely on the graveyard. So a couple of really strong Floodgates. We have some more Floodgates before I talk about the trap holes. We had Stygian Dirge. This card seems interesting, but it reduces the opponent's monsters by 1 level. Some of these decks are very specific on having 2 level 4s or 2 level 3s or whatever it might be to pull off good combos. And if you reduce all of your opponent's monsters by 1 level, they can never go into their extra deck. Imagine an Infernity player who can't go into the extra deck because they can't access Laval Chain because they don't obviously play level 5s, which would then be level 4. So this was a Floodgate that was really powerful against some of the specific combo decks like Infernities. Then we have 2 Light Imprisoning Mirrors. This obviously was a concession for the power and strength of Lightsworns, but it's also a hose for the Bujin matchup. That deck has all light monsters, so a couple copies of Light Imprisoning Mirror. And then in terms of the trap holes to combine with our essentially 2 copies of Myrmelio when we need them, there are 2 Deep Dark trap holes. This card was useful against decks that obviously special summon big monsters, level 5 or higher. It banishes them, so it could hit a Dragon Ruler, which is really useful. It could hit some of the Sylvans, which is really useful. It could hit some of the monsters out of the Mermail matchup. And then 2 copies of Acid Trap Hole. This one was really good in the mirror match because you can obviously search it. That's the whole point of having these trap holes. But when you hit an armor with this, it actually makes it miss the effect because the monster flips, then gets destroyed. It makes it so that you can make a armor mistiming. And it also can be done more specifically if you chain it. So like, for example, you activate any card in the game, or your opponent does, and you just chain Acid Trap Hole on your opponent's set armor. And now the armor flips as Chain Link 2 and then gets destroyed. Obviously, that would make it mistiming. That's also useful because there are cards like Geargia Accelerator that your opponent could set. Like, it might not necessarily just be Geargia armor. And that would also make it mistiming. So very useful and versatile card in the mirror match. Make it so that it's really hard for your opponent, obviously, to set monsters. Makes it, and in combination with Nobleman of Cross, you might actually want to keep armor in face-up defense position, as odd as that sounds, so that you can flip it face down and flip it face up on your turn, and at least generate some card advantage there. But nevertheless, that is a look at the 2014 Geargia deck, piloted by Brandon Wigley to the top 64 of the U.S. Nationals, or rather the North American World Championship qualifier. We're not at just the U.S. at this point. But thank you for watching. That's Giorlando for Yu-Gi-Oh! History. Check back soon for plenty more Yu-Gi-Oh! content.